Welcome to episode 306 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired bureau attorney Steve Kramer and retired agent Steve Busch. In part one of this two-part episode, Steve and Steve review how Steve Kramer teamed up with Paul Holes, an investigator for the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office, to use investigative genetic genealogy to generate leads to identify the person known as the Golden State Killer. Prior to Kramer and Holes working together, 15 different law enforcement agencies spent 43 years, 200,000 man-hours, and $10 million trying to figure out who was responsible for the murders and rapes. Kramer and Holes took a different approach and assembled and led a team of 6 people, spent $217, and identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the infamous Golden State Killer after only 63 days. After the successful resolution of that case, Steve Kramer and Steve Busch teamed up at the Orange County Resident Agency out of the Los Angeles Division of the FBI to form the FBI's first forensic genetic genealogy team. Steve Kramer served in the FBI for 20 years. He was an in-house counsel for the Los Angeles Division, responsible for legal matters in the FBI's criminal and national security investigations, where he oversaw investigative techniques and strategies. Previously, Steve had worked as a federal prosecutor and a deputy district attorney, where he prosecuted homicide, corporate fraud, and national security cases. After assembling and leading the team of investigators that helped solve the notorious Golden State Killer case, he finished his bureau career as the co-founder of the FBI's National Genetic Genealogy Team. Steve Busch served in the FBI for 19 years. Formerly a private sector engineer, in the FBI, he worked a variety of investigative assignments, including counterterrorism and white-collar crime, while also honing his leadership skills as a SWAT sniper team leader in the Los Angeles Division. He later became the co-founder of the FBI's first forensic genetic genealogy team, the first agent assigned to work full-time to assist law enforcement agencies in the identification of suspects using genetic genealogy, and the co-founder and the architect of the FBI's National Forensic Genetic Genealogy, FGG, program and team, now known as the Investigative Genetic Genealogy, or IGG team. In 2021, Steve Busch and Steve Kramer left the FBI and founded Indago Solutions, an IA-based software, as a service that automates genetic genealogy to produce investigative leads and identify subjects. They continue to work regularly with the U.S. Department of Justice and with state and local investigators to solve cases through the use of genetic genealogy. We'll talk more about that in part 2 of this two-part episode. Now, before we get to the case review, this is my first episode of 2024, so Happy New Year! Sharing and writing FBI stories is my creative passion. I wake up every day fueled by excitement and curiosity about who I will meet, what I will learn, and what I will create. I love what I do. Did you know that this month I'm celebrating 8 years of podcasting, which is mind-boggling to me, but I started FBI Retired Case File Review in January of 2016. So please help me celebrate yet another milestone by sharing the podcast with a friend or 2 or 3. Help me spread the word. And by the way, for the next few months, to release some of the upcoming episodes stacked up on my shelf, I'll be posting 3 episodes instead of 2 a month. But for my own sanity, I hope to return to an every other week schedule as soon as possible. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels. All available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thanks for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired FBI attorney Steve Kramer and retired FBI agent Steve Busch. Hi, guys. How are you?
Great, Jerry. How are you? Thanks for having us on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're doing great. Thanks, Jerry.
I was able to meet Steve Busch at CrimeCon, and I can tell you, I'm going to confess that I really didn't know anything about the technology that we're going to be talking about today in any detail before I met you and then took a deep dive into your website. But I had discussed the case that was like the origin for the software that you created when I interviewed former FBI profiler Julia Cowley in episode 242. So when we start talking about the case, I'll keep referring people to that particular episode. But there's something on your website that I thought I would read. It says, millions of people throughout the world have provided their DNA to consumer genomics companies to determine ancestry and how they're related to others. And I know that I did that myself. So what we're going to be talking about today is how that practice has now become an investigative tool.
No, that's right, Jerry. And it's interesting because the tool goes by many different names. Initially at the Bureau, we were calling it Investigative Genealogy, and that then became Investigative Genetic Genealogy. Some people call it Forensic Genetic Genealogy, but for the call today, we'll just call it Genetic Genealogy. And it's more or less the process of taking suspect DNA from a crime scene and figuring out who it belongs to. And we'll get into the details of that today, and I think you'll find it fascinating.
Well, I know that and again, from a deep dive into your website, which I will link to in the show notes, because I think anybody who is interested in this needs to go to your website. But on your website, it talks about how this all started. So I guess, Steve Kramer, why don't you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. So the watershed case for genetic genealogy was really the Golden State Killer case, which was a serial murderer rapist who basically terrorized northern, southern, and central California from the early 1970s until the mid-1980s. It was actually a Sacramento FBI case, a serial killer, 306 case. And I actually heard about that case back in 2013. I remember it really well, actually. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was reading the LA Times magazine. It was a magazine that came with the LA Times newspaper. And there was a article in there by this author, Michelle McNamara. And it was really detailed investigative reporting talking about this killer who had committed all these crimes in 2 parts of the state at the time that we knew about, the Sacramento Bay Area, and then also the Orange County and Santa Barbara, Ventura County areas. So I was fascinated about this case because this guy had committed crimes very brazenly, going into homes, raping women, and then eventually murdering, couples, attacking people, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends at the same time. I mean, very, very, as we know, very high risk type of crimes, and doing this when law enforcement in the neighborhoods were all looking for him, particularly in the Sacramento area. So I felt, looking at it, I'm like, well, the one thing I do know is he left his DNA all over the state of California. Nobody had a fingerprint of him, and we didn't have a real good look at him. He always wore a mask. So really the only forensic evidence that we had to identify him was DNA. And I figured, hey, I'm at the FBI. I've worked with DNA before, and the FBI lab is great. And so we'll see what I can do. So I literally went into work the next day. One of the TFOs, task force officers on the violent crime squad, was a friend of mine. I asked him about this Golden State Killer case, which we called the EAR case, East Area Rapist, as it was known then. And he put me in touch with I believe the sergeant that was in charge of it, who I knew as well. And he's like, yeah, Steve, knock yourself out. Here's access to the case and go to town. And so that's how I got involved in 2013 on the Golden State Killer case.
Even though I have referred people back to episode 242, I do think we should probably just take a few moments to talk about this Joseph James DeAngelo. Of course, at that time, nobody knew who was responsible, but what had this subject done? I know that it covered like almost a 10-year period that he was doing what he was doing, but let's kind of summarize how bad this dude was, because I'm sure that had a lot to do with Steve Kramer wanting to solve this case. So why don't we backtrack just a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. The Golden State Killer, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, we referred to him as the East Area Rapist. We didn't use the name Golden State Killer until after DeAngelo was actually arrested. And it started actually about 1974 in Central California in the town of Visalia, where they had this individual who committed in a year and a half period about over 120 burglaries. He'd go in and wouldn't take things of a lot of value, although he would take certain firearms, but he'd take one earring, from a person. He'd tear out photos of family albums. And some of these burglaries were what the detectives said were kind of sexual in nature. He'd take women's underwear and, put it on the bed, put it on the sofa. Kind of weird, but really prolific. And they had a really difficult time, trying to catch him. It eventually ended in a murder of a woman. At one point, he tried to kidnap a 16-year-old girl from her house, and her father tried to stop this individual, who was at that point was called the Visalia Ransacker. And the ransacker shot her dad 2 times in the front doorway and killed him. And then a few months later, he was ambushed by a detective at a stakeout and shot the detective. And that was the end of the Visalia Ransacker. That case ended in, I believe it was December of 1975. And then in June of 1976, we had this new individual, which later became known as the East Area Rapist, east part of Sacramento. And he would break into homes and rape women very violently and for long periods of time. And after several of these types of attacks on women, he started attacking couples, and that became his MO. He would break into your house in the middle of the night. You'd be sleeping with your spouse, and he would shine a flashlight on you, and then he would point a gun at the couple and have the woman tie up the man. And then he would tie up the woman, retie the man, and then he'd put plates, dishes from the kitchen or dining room on top of the man, take the woman to another room, and proceed to rape her. And he would stop, get himself a beer, make himself some food in their house, and then go back and rape her again. This would go on sometimes for hours. And he'd always be very careful to go back and check on the man to make sure, the plates were still there and he had not moved. Because he said, if I hear these plates fall off of you, I will come back here and kill you and your wife and your family. So this went on for several years. It also ended in the murders of 2 people, Brian and Katie Maggiore, who were out walking their dog at 9:30 at night. They think that they stumbled upon the East Area Rapist, and he confronted them and ended up essentially executing them both at point blank range with his firearm. Eventually, that case, the East Area Rapist, which spread to surrounding cities outside of Sacramento and to the Bay Area, that stopped in 1978, and it proceeded a few months later. I believe it was October of 1978, if I have my year right, with an attack in Ventura County, very similar to the East Area Rapist attack, where the individual comes in and ties up the couple. So this went on for several more murders in Orange County from 1978, 79. It stopped in 1981, and there was one more in Orange County. There were 4 murders in Orange County. We had Ventura County, and we also had Santa Barbara County, where all these crimes occurred. Very similar MO to that, except he was killing the people by beating them to death with usually an object that was found at the house, whether it be a log, a lamp, or some other object, a hammer. And then it stopped in 1986 with the last murder in Irvine. The unique thing about this case is that these cases were never connected for years, for decades. It was almost 25 years to connect the case. Obviously, the Sacramento area knew about the East Area Rapist, and in Orange County, Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, the killer down there was known as the original Night Stalker. Interesting enough, they didn't even connect those murders in Orange County, Santa Barbara County, and Ventura County to the same individual until CODIS came online in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when they realized, wow, we had 20 years ago a serial killer operating here in Southern California. And that person was dubbed the original Night Stalker. And he was called original because there was a Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, as well. But these crimes predated the Richard Ramirez Night Stalker crime spree. So he was dubbed informally by law enforcement as original Night Stalker. In that case, the original Night Stalker wasn't connected until I believe 2002 with the East Area Rapist, when the DNA at the Sacramento Crime Lab caught up with the Southern California technology, and they were able to make a case comparison between the two. And they realized that they had this serial killer that had been operating in the 1970s and 1980s in both Northern and Southern California. And there was always kind of a rumor in the case as to whether or not this original Night Stalker, East Area Rapist, was also the Visalia ransacker. And if you ask, most of the detectives in the case, I'd say 50% would say the Visalia ransacker was not the same guy, and the other half would say he is the same guy. Later on, we determined, after they arrested Joe DeAngelo, that it was, in fact, the same guy.
So it sounds like his last act was about 1986?
That's correct, in Irvine, California.
When was it that you became interested in using DNA to solve this case?
Got involved in the case in 2013.
Now, you were assigned to LA at the time, the LA division of the FBI?
Correct. I was an attorney. I was in the Chief Division Counsel's office. I was an assistant or associate division counsel. I actually worked out of the Orange County RA. I was the only attorney there. And I figured it would be kind of a fun hobby to work on this case. So obviously it wasn't part of my regular legal duties, as you know, which was advising agents on different legal strategies, approving different techniques, things like that. I figured this was just a case that I could work on because I knew it was going to require some type of legal hurdle to get the FBI to do something with DNA. So that's how I figured I could be useful, because I knew people, obviously, at OGC, the Office of General Counsel, that probably helped the legal aspect of getting this done. I'd been a former attorney, a former prosecutor as well. So I had some ideas of how we could do it. And so my first call was to call the FBI lab and see what they could do with CODIS.
So you'll have to explain to people what CODIS is and the limitations of CODIS when it comes to DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. CODIS is actually a software for the database. The FBI database is called NDIS, the National DNA Index System, and it consists of DNA from generally convicted individuals as well as arrestees from certain states. It has today, I think there's over 20 million profiles in it. And the particular profile that's in this database, in the NDIS database, is what we call an STR. It stands for short tandem repeat. It's a type of technology, a DNA profile that's been around for 30 years or more. And it's very, very, very useful at identifying one person against everybody else on the planet. It's not uncommon to hear, these incredible odds that there'd be a random match. I believe in the Golden State Killer case, it was 1 out of 47 septillion, like 20 zeros after 47, I think it was something like that. So incredible odds. It's excellent Steve and I would say, it's excellent at finding the needle in the haystack. But if you're not in the database, if you don't have an STR profile in the database, then CODIS, which is again the software that runs NDIS, then you come up with 0. In other words, you don't have the lottery ticket that matches, the winning numbers, then you don't know who your guy is. And that's what happened in the Golden State Killer case when they did put his DNA profile, his STR profile, into the NDIS database. There was no match. And there never was a match until after Joe DeAngelo was actually arrested.
And again, there was no match because he had never been convicted or arrested for the type of crime where his DNA would be collected.
That is correct. We had his DNA in the database. It just wasn't matching anybody. And fortunately for him, when he committed his crimes, the last one we know about was in 1986, CODIS didn't exist then. And so he didn't have the opportunity to get swabbed, upon conviction or upon arrest, where his DNA would actually go into the database. So we didn't feel, generally we'd say he's kind of aged out. We figured at this point in time, late 1990s, when CODIS came online, he'd probably aged out of most of his criminal career at that point. He'd probably be in his, 50s, 60s at that point in time. So there wasn't really a hope that he'd get arrested or convicted and have to put his DNA into CODIS.
All right. So at this point, that's kind of been determined, or that's the thought. So what is it that you're thinking could be done? If he's not going to be able to get a hit on CODIS, then what else is there?
Well, the first thing I thought about is there's another DNA technique that uses the same criminal profile, that STR profile that goes into these CODIS type of databases, and it's called familial searching. And familial searching is different than genetic genealogy. Familial searching is where you search the database, let's say a CODIS database, I'll call it, like in a state, because each individual state also has their own type of CODIS database with the offenders from that particular state. And you can search those profiles, not the same way you look for one, but you're looking to find, say you have a case where you have a murder that's left DNA at the crime scene and it doesn't match in CODIS. Well, this isn't technically right, but I think it's a good way to think about it. You kind of relax the standard of all the markers on the STR, and you look for somebody that matches a relaxed standard of that CODIS STR, and that would give you a relative that's in the database. And generally, it would be a first-degree relative of the person you're looking for. First degree being a parent, a sibling, a child. And there's several states. I think now there's probably a dozen states across the country, including California, that do familial searching. And they actually did that also in the Golden State Killer case. They did familial searching, looking to see if the Golden State Killer had a first-degree relative in the state CODIS database. And that didn't work.
But again, in that situation, one of those relatives would have had to have committed a crime that made their DNA available.
That is correct. So if the Golden State Killer had a relative that had gotten convicted of a crime and their DNA was put into the state CODIS database, and then we ran a familial search on the Golden State Killer, it would likely match that close relative. If it was a sibling, a parent, or a child. And we tried that. It didn't work. We tried it actually in numerous states. In fact, one of the things that I did as part of the team, we'd write letters to other states and ask them to run the Golden State Killer, his profile, in a familiar way, in a familiar search in their state. And I thought, well, what if we did this with the FBI? What if we get the FBI national DNA database to run a familiar search? And, unfortunately, Bureau is a bureaucracy, as we all know, and I could not get the lab to do it. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them was it might crash the system. And another reason was it might produce 2,000 false matches. By the way, all the investigators were more than happy to take 2,000 false matches, but the lab didn't want to do it. And then the other issue was the Bureau did not want to make a one-time exception for one particular case, as they felt they would have to do it on every case after that. So that was the roadblock there with CODIS. So what other ways could we use DNA? Because like we said, we had a lot of DNA from over 50 rapes in the case. So what else could we do? That was the next question.
Before you go on to that next question, I have to ask, why you? You're an FBI attorney. You are supposed to be weighing in on search warrants and documents and, are we proceeding correctly, legally in some of the cases that we work. And now you've moved into this investigative area.
Yeah, no, it was, like I said, I started it just as a hobby. I had published, when I was in law school, a law review article on DNA. Actually, when I was in law school, after I published that article, the FBI actually called me. The FBI lab contacted me, a lowly law student out in California, and had questions for me about, how DNA worked. And, I was really fortunate. I was working with Woody Clark, who go on to be one of the DNA prosecutors on the O.J. Simpson case. And so I had a great mentor with DNA. And so I had a little bit, and I do mean a little bit of expertise with DNA. And I thought that's where I could be useful. And again, FBI agents and detectives, they tend to rely on, particularly in the FBI, you rely on lawyers to make sure that you're doing the right thing. I used to joke that my job really at the FBI was to be CYA. Agents would come to me with questions and they'd want to know if it was okay to do, whatever they were planning. And I'd say, yeah, go ahead and put my name down. there's any questions, you could say legal approved it. I felt that in this case, that kind of CYA would be, particularly doing something new and innovative, would be helpful. I actually called the FBI case agent in Sacramento, Marcus Knutson, and said, hey, do you mind if I work on this case with some of the agents down in Orange County? We want to see what we can do in the DNA. And he was great. And he said, great, go for it. And so we did. So I got together with Orange County Sheriff's Department and the Orange County DA's office, and we started, brainstorming how to solve this case.
Hey, Jerry, I'll jump in real quick too. I'll answer that question a little bit of a different way as to why did Steve Kramer get involved? He has the uncanny ability to just need to get involved in other people's business sometimes. And it actually is one of his greatest attributes is he has a curiosity, like we all do. All investigators at the FBI have an investigative curiosity. You want to figure out why things happen. I mean, that's the whole purpose of being an agent, right? We want to take an effect and we want to reason back to the cause. We want to figure out, hey, this thing happened. Well, how did it happen and why did it happen? Steve just has that mindset, and he wants to get involved with a lot of things like this. And I will tell you, and this is a good little setup, the dynamic of what that created at the Bureau was very interesting, because in the beginning, when Kramer first made this known, because you know what a squad bay is like, Jerry. You sat in one, right? You kind of got a bullpen of agents, right? And you've got desks around. You can hear what your other squad mates are doing. Well, Kramer's talking about how he's going to solve the Golden State Killer case. And nobody took him seriously in the beginning. People were kind of like, oh, okay, Steve, that sounds great. Yeah, why don't you go ahead? So 650 other detectives have tried to solve that case, Steve, and you're going to jump in here with some new technique that's never been done before, and you're going to solve it. Like, have a blast. If you can put that man on the moon, Steve, I'd love to see it happen. And so it was interesting. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit throughout the podcast today as to how that dynamic shifted from the beginning of people not believing in what would happen all the way until the end when they saw the actual results of what had taken place.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We'll definitely do that. All right, so let's get back to the Golden State Killer case.
When I got involved in the case in 2013, I thought, DNA was the way to do it. But clearly it wasn't going to work with the STRs, as we previously talked about, because Joe DeAngelo's DNA, although it was in the database, it was never actually taken from him, with his identity on it, where he could be matched to it. He didn't get arrested for a crime where he was required to provide his DNA. So the investigators, myself included, we started thinking of other ideas, other ways we could use DNA. And I want to be real clear about this. People have been doing genetic genealogy or wanting to do genetic genealogy in law enforcement for a long time. I've heard of investigators that had tried to subpoena, Ancestry.com for DNA, things like that. So we had talked about that in the Golden State Killer Working Group, I'll call it, down in Orange County. We actually had his Y DNA. Y DNA is a little bit different than the regular STR. It's still an STR, a short tandem repeat, but Y DNA is, as you can imagine, it's DNA from the Y chromosome, which obviously only men have. And you can take this Y DNA, and there's websites out there still today where you can type in the profile of the Y DNA and you can search that against members of the public that have put their Y DNA into these different databases. And so some of the investigators had done that on the case. My colleague, Paul Holes, had done that. And it was fascinating that, you could take Y STR DNA and match it with the general public. Now, Y DNA is not very discerning. It's not going to give you, even if you have a perfect match, it's not going to give you the person that you match with. It doesn't have to be the same person as you. It's not going to be your subject. It's just going to be a common relative. If you have the same YSTR, like I have the same YSTR as my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather. So it's useful for determining surnames of people. In fact, there was a case, our colleague, Colleen Fitzpatrick, who's a genetic genealogist and rocket scientist, she'd actually done one of the first cases like that out of Phoenix, Arizona, where she had identified a common name, and I believe the name was Miller, in a series of murders in the Phoenix area. And the police went back through their suspect list and they found a Miller. And they went and got his DNA, and he ended up having a STR match, a full FBI CODIS match to the killer's DNA in that case. So that was one of the first solves where a public DNA database had been used to help solve a crime.
I have to admit that it was a little bit hard for me to understand the difference between this Y DNA and what did you say, STR?
Correct. The short tandem repeat.
So what's the main difference? It sounded similar. If you're going to be able to connect me to a relative, in this case, only a male relative. So is that the main difference?
Generally, yes. The profiles that are used in the National DNA Index System, or CODIS, I'll call it. CODIS profile is based upon the DNA that we have in the what we call autosomal DNA. And it's, the 22 chromosomes that everybody shares. And then you have the sex chromosome, the X and the Y chromosome. So obviously men have the Y chromosome. You can look at the Y chromosome and look at the short tandem repeats in that. And they can look at any number from 10, 15, 20, I think up to some of the private labs create 111 different STRs that you can look at. Just because you match somebody on all those STRs, that might mean that you share a relative at some point in time in your history. Like it might be 500 years ago that you had somebody that shared some of those same markers with you, or the people that do share some of the same markers with you. Your common relative, your most common recent ancestor might go back several hundred years. The reason the Y is useful for that, it's the surname. Generally, particularly Western Europe, United States, for the last 600 years, generally men, name their sons with the same last name, the same surname that they had. And so your surname will carry along with your Y DNA. So that Y DNA STR stays basically the same, and the surname travels with that. So like I said earlier, my father has the same Y DNA as me, and the same as my grandfather, and further back. And the mutation on the STR, to get into some of the science, is not that great. In other words, it should be pretty similar to the STRs that I share with my father and my grandfather. So the further back you go, it might mutate a little bit, but it's very likely that if you match most of the Y STR with somebody else, that you have a common ancestor in your history. And that's why Colleen Fitzpatrick was able to identify, hey, this STR, this Y STR, is common with the name Miller. Lots of people with the name Miller have this, and that's how she used it. Is it useful for solving crimes? In my opinion, we don't really use it much, even with genetic genealogy, but it was at the time, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, the only thing we really had on the Golden State Killer was his Y DNA and search it against these databases. And that's what was really interesting to me is like, okay, how do we get into these databases? So when the light bulb went off, it was like, how do we get in to these databases? And I want to be clear, like everyone's like, who came up with the idea to do genetic genealogy? It wasn't me. I don't think it was even Paul Holes. It was a technology that everybody wanted to do. It was just a matter of how you're going to do it. And that was the key, is how are we going to do that? And I think this was actually the power of the FBI. And Paul Holes tells the story when he talks about it, is having the FBI on board opened up a lot of doors.
Now, you did mention that people had tried in the past to use a subpoena or, some type of court order to get this information. And I take it, that makes it sound like that had been rejected or declined in the past.
Steve, let me jump in on that. So, Jerry, to kind of put some context to that, it would be like you've probably served many subpoenas in your career. It would be like taking a license plate and sending it to Verizon Wireless and saying, can you take this license plate and search it against your database and let it know if it matches anybody? And Verizon Wireless is going to tell you what? They're going to say, well, we don't have a database of license plates. We have a database of phone numbers. So if you want to search a phone number, you have to give us a phone number. One of the mistakes that these previous investigators were making is they were taking an STR profile, the CODIS profile that Steve mentioned, and they're sending that to a database that doesn't have STR profiles. Ancestry, 23andMe, as Steve is going to talk about, they don't have STRs. They have a different profile. They have a phone number profile, if you will, instead of a license plate.
Wow. Yeah, that just really opened up everything. I'm sure everybody listening is like, oh, I get it. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a really common misconception. Like Steve and I have gone out many, many, many times and done training for law enforcement on genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy uses a different type of DNA profile, which we call a SNP, stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. And just like Steve said, using a license plate versus a phone number, we'll just say it's an apple and an orange. You got an apple and an orange, and you can't get apple juice from an orange. And it's funny, we tell people this at the beginning of our training, and then a lot of times detectives will come up to us afterwards and be like, hey, I got the DNA in CODIS. Can we take that and get a SNP? And you can't get this genealogy profile, the SNP, from an STR. You have to go back to the original evidence, the rape kit, the blood from the crime, wherever you got the original DNA from. You can't convert, an STR into the SNP. And that was one of the first kind of eye-opening things on this case is like, okay, we have the STR. It's not matching anywhere. He's never going to have his DNA in the CODIS database. Like, he's not going to get arrested. We weren't hoping on that. I mean, a lot of people thought he might be dead by the 2000s anyway. So how do we get his DNA? Like, how do we get the SNP? And then if we get a SNP, how do we get it into Ancestry? And that's where being part of the FBI was really helpful. Because as we all know, the FBI generally carries a lot of weight. When companies get a call from the FBI, people get a little nervous. And it was great because Paul and I would get on a conference call and we'd call Ancestry. And like, there's an attorney from the FBI that wants to talk to some executive, and they'd put us through. It was great. So we talked to the privacy officers, some of the executives at all these different companies, and they completely shut us down. We'd argue with their in-house counsel, their outside counsel about figuring out, why can't you help us take this DNA and put it into your database? Eventually, one of the executives, the CEO of one of the databases called Family Tree DNA, a man named Bennett Greenspan, he said, you know what? This is a terrible crime. This is an awful crime, and it deserves to be solved, because I will help you do this, Steve. If you can get me the DNA from the crime scene, I will create a SNP and I will upload it to the database. And that's exactly what happened.
All right. And why did the others reject you? Why did the others say that?
To put it succinctly, they were just terrified of the public perception and that it would hurt their business. That, hey, if we let law enforcement into this database, people will not want to upload to our database. They'll be concerned about that the police are in there. The unique thing about these databases, and Steve brought up like Verizon and searching telephone numbers. As we all know, we can do that with a court order. It's not even a probable cause court order. It's simply either a subpoena, right? And the standard on a subpoena is simply relevancy. It's relevant to our case. So give us all of your phone numbers, all your toll records. And when you sign up, for a phone, say a cell phone, you're not agreeing to give the numbers that you call to the police or to any members of the general public. Yet the police can get it anytime they want when that information is relevant to their investigation. With genetic genealogy databases, everybody puts their DNA in there with the agreement that, hey, I want to match with everybody in the database. And there's a common misperception, and we should clear this up right now, that when you put your DNA, say, into Ancestry or 23andMe or Family Tree DNA, that you're actually sharing your genetic data, your whole genome, or whatever, with other people. You're actually not. What you're sharing is how much the percentage of DNA that you share with your relatives, because that's all genetic genealogy really is finding out how much DNA you share with somebody. So, Jerry, for instance, I can tell you share exactly 50% of your DNA with your mother and 50% of your DNA with your father. And you share about 25% of your grandfather's DNA. In fact, you share about 25% with each of your grandparents. And that's all genetic genealogy is simply how much DNA do you share with somebody? So you upload your DNA to these databases. They don't show people your genetic code, really. What they're showing you is how much DNA you share with somebody. So, cousins will share a small percentage of DNA. Your fifth cousin, you're talking very fractional portions of DNA. And that's what this is. So people agree to put their DNA into these databases, and they say, I want my DNA to be shared with everybody in the database because I want to know all my relatives. So right there, you're essentially agreeing that, hey, I have no privacy in this. I'm sharing my DNA with others. Very different than like you have with your phone company and your phone numbers. You're not agreeing to share your numbers with the general public or certainly the police. It's a lot different with the genetic genealogy companies because you are actually putting that information out there. And when you do that, there's Supreme Court law, you've abandoned, your privacy interest in that. And that's the angle that we were going on. So yeah, I wasn't concerned about the legal aspects of it. And obviously I'd talked with DOJ and Office of General Counsel at the FBI about it, and everyone agreed there was no legal impediment to doing this, to uploading the Golden State Killer's DNA. But to be honest with you, I don't think anybody thought I'd be able to do it. But when Bennett Greenspan from Family Tree DNA said, hey, I'll do it, that's great. Whereas I think the other companies were just afraid for, public blowback. And, even to this day, they won't do that. And they cite that as their main concern when I have spoken to them about it.
Well, hey, Steve, to kind of expand a little on the DNA phone number analogy that you mentioned. So, Jerry, your cell phone number is probably something you hold near and dear to your heart. You wouldn't want it published necessarily on the front page of the New York Times.
No.
For everybody to call you, right?
Right.
But what if I told you, Jerry, that you and I share 20% of our phone number in common, right? You have 10 digits in your phone number and I have 10 digits in my phone number. And if you and I shared 20%, you could say, well, 2 out of those 10 digits are the same. Would you be okay with putting that on the front page of the New York Times? And the answer is, of course, right? Because that doesn't tell anybody anything about you to know that you share 20%, even if you knew what those digits were. Even if you said, I know that it's a 2, in the 3rd spot and a 5 in the 7th spot of my phone number, the 2 digits I share with Steve Busch and his phone number, it still doesn't tell me. And I can't send you a text, right? I can't make a call to your phone number with that information. And that's kind of how, like, a different way of looking at how the shared DNA works within these databases.
Yeah, that's helpful. So you've been able to get this one company to say yes. They are going to let you, did you say the Family Tree DNA?
That's correct. Right. Family Tree DNA is a genetic genealogy company and database in Houston, Texas. And their CEO at the time was a man and the founder of the company called Bennett Greenspan. And he agreed to help the FBI and Paul Holes and I solve this case by uploading the Golden State Killer's DNA to his database.
Of course, I'm thinking as a crime novelist, I'm thinking, well, you probably could have just made up a profile and sent it in as your own and let them come back to you and match you with different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we could have done that. But part of the problem back then was we didn't know how viable it was to get a SNP profile from a crime scene, particularly, a 40-year-old case, and then get it into the database. So what would be the difficulty on that? What labs do we have to use?
Okay. Yeah. You didn't have the cheek swab. You didn't have the fresh cheek swab to send in.
Exactly.
It's a good point, Jerry, because the way they do the technology for Ancestry 23andMe is you have a vial that you spit into, and it's incredibly high quantity and high quality DNA that comes from your saliva in a massive, massive vial, right, that you send in order to get that profile done.
Right. I've done it. I've done it myself.
Yeah. So you get it.
Yeah. If any of my relatives are out there who are, and I say this in a joking way, and I don't mean to joke in that sense, but they've committed a violent crime or a rape, maybe one day the fact that I submitted it, will help solve a crime. I hope not, but that's amazing to think about, and everybody listening to think about that as a viable concept now that this genetic genealogy is part of our investigative toolbox.
Yeah, it's a fantastic tool. It's amazing. And we can talk about it more later, perhaps. But you can solve almost any case. If there's DNA, we can identify who that DNA contributor is. It's an amazing technique.
All right. And this is a technical question, but I'm just curious of how you get STR DNA and make it a SNP sample. Is that easy?
Well, if you remember what I said earlier, when I gave you the apples and oranges analogy, you can't get apple juice from an orange or vice versa. So you cannot get a SNP from an STR profile. An STR profile, Jerry, is simply a set of numbers. It could be 20 pairs of numbers, any number between 13 and 20. That's what an STR is. It's simply a set of numbers. The SNP profile is actually 700,000 different, what we call nucleotides from different parts in the genome that are related to basically inheritedness, like what you inherit from your relatives. The trick to getting it is you have to go back to the original evidence. And that's what we did in the Golden State Killer case. That's when Bennett Greenspan said, send me the DNA, not the profile, not the STR, send me the raw DNA. And so Paul Holes, who was with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, he was an investigator there. And Paul, by the way, was just like, he'd been working on the Golden State Killer case for well over 20 years and knew the case far better than I think anybody. He was like an encyclopedia on that case. And I'll tell you, I never had to read a police report on the Golden State Killer. One, because Paul knew everything. And two, I wasn't interested in going back and looking what the investigators did. I was strictly focused on what the DNA would tell us. So there was a murder of Charlene Smith and her husband, Lyman Smith, in 1981, where she was raped and then brutally beat to death with a log from their log pile outside. And during the examination, the medical examiner in that case had actually taken 2 rape kits. The first rape kit was used to develop the STR profile in the case back in the rape kit was taken in 1981, and then the STR profile was developed 20 years later, probably around the year 2000. But there was a second rape case there, and it had been in the freezer for over 3 decades. The examiner in that case had realized it was probably a big case, a double homicide like that. So he had taken 2 just to be safe, which was great because now we had preserved evidence in the case that had been sitting in the freezer since 1981. So Paul Holes, myself, and an agent from the FBI Orange County RA, Steve Rathall, the 3 of us went to Ventura County and we sat down with the DA and the lab personnel and we briefed them about what we wanted to do, how we wanted to do this thing called genetic genealogy. And we wanted to upload it to Family Tree DNA and this other database called GEDmatch. These are the 2 databases. They allow you to take a profile, like a SNP profile, and actually upload it to their databases. Steve had mentioned earlier Ancestry and 23andMe, where you have to do these vials or cheek swabs. And as you know, we can't get that from the killer. We only have a rape kit that's been in a freezer. And also, that the only way you can get into Ancestry is by going through their pipeline, their process with that vial of saliva and going to their lab. So I don't have the ability, the general public doesn't have the ability to just upload a profile like you do with GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. So that was our first step, get the DNA. So we briefed the crime lab, we briefed the DA's office in Ventura County, and they agreed. They said, let's give it a shot. So they said, have an FBI agent come get it. So we had an FBI agent go to the crime lab, pick up that rape kit, and send the DNA via FedEx to Family Tree DNA in Houston, Texas, where they took it, put it in their lab, and they created a SNP profile of the Golden State Killer. And they took that SNP, uploaded it to their database. And then about 5 weeks later, we had matches.
I'm thinking of an analogy, and it may be too elementary, but you can tell me whether this is right or wrong when we talk about apples and oranges. So you go to the grocery store and you get an apple and you go home and your kids say, no, I want orange juice. Well, you can't make orange juice out of the apple. So you actually go back to the grocery store and get an orange. That sounds like a very basic way of saying what happened.
That's a great way of saying it. That's exactly what happened. You have to go back to the original evidence. And I say that because no matter how many times we do talks on this and tell detectives, everybody seems to think that. And it's a logical thing to think, well, we got one profile. Why can't we get the other profile from that same one? And you just can't. You got to go back to the grocery store and pick up the apple. And that's essentially what we did. It literally went back to the crime lab and picked it up and then sent that rape kit out to get new DNA extracted to create the SNP profile. And we were really fortunate because when they created that profile, it uploaded beautifully. We actually had a lot of DNA, which was, you don't get that a lot of times. But again, it was a pristine sample, had been frozen since 1981. And we had a great result. It went into the database, no problem. And we waited for matches. And that was the hard part. They told us it would take several weeks, but it took several weeks. And we got an email that the matches were ready. And I remember it very well. Paul Holes and I called each other and we were like 2 kids at Christmas. Like literally, we were so excited because we're like, we have thousands of matches, thousands of relatives of the Golden State Killer, like truly the first forensic lead in 43 years. In this case, we actually had genetic relatives of the Golden State Killer. And it was now just a matter of trying to figure out how these relatives were related to the Golden State Killer so we could identify them. So we were super excited, had no idea what to do next.
I think it's important, Jerry, to understand too, when Steve says relatives, I like to always put it in quotes, relatives. These aren't Thanksgiving relatives, as I like to say. These aren't the people that come to your house on the holidays. We're talking about distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins. I oftentimes, when I lecture, I'll ask people, I'll say, hey, raise your hand. I'll give you $20 out of my pocket right now if you can name a third cousin once removed in your family. Nobody knows who that person is. It's not a common person. So these aren't names that you would recognize as being relatives of yours. These are people who are distantly related to you. And this is where, and Steve's going to get into this is where the technology of relating those folks to each other and then reverse engineering their family trees to determine who was the one contributor of the DNA that could produce all of these relative relationships that we see on the list.
That's really fascinating, especially when you use the term reverse engineering your family tree.
Well, think about it, Jerry. What most people do when you put your DNA into Ancestry.com, you want to build your family tree, right? You know who your parents are generally, and you say, hey, this is my mom, this is my dad, and you're going to build your tree upward, just like a tree grows, right? From the roots, we're going to start down at the bottom, and we're going to build up as high as we can go. And you see people building their trees back, to the 1700s and determining that they're related to a Revolutionary War family or, somebody from the Civil War, and it's really exciting for them to kind of see where they came from. We do that process, but we do it backward, okay? Because we're starting with your distant relatives. We have to build them upward and connect them together. And then we reverse back down to figure out where the roots of that tree came from.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. All right. So 5 weeks later, after submitting this information, you get these thousands of quote unquote relatives. Now, is the rest of that work scientific or is it boots on the ground trying to do investigative connections?
It's a little bit of both. Genealogy, particularly genetic genealogy. And when I say genetic genealogy, genetics being, in this case, just how much DNA you share with different people. And genealogy simply being, the traditional, who are your parents, who are your grandparents, who are your great-grandparents. And with genetic genealogy, you can use the shared DNA to make determinations, right? If I said, obviously, if you share 50%, you must be a parent-child relationship because, parents and children share 50% of their DNA. So there is a little bit of science in it, but a lot of it is just going through records, going through databases, and, very similar to what law enforcement will do in a lot of cases when you try to identify people and get background information. You'll search social media, you'll go to Accurate or TLO and do database checks on people. So it's a little bit of that. But as Steve said, you go even further back, even to the 1700s, you're looking at census records, old birth records, marriage records, things like that. So that's what our team did. So we get these matches, we have thousands of matches, and we uploaded to GEDmatch and we got more matches. So Paul Holes called a genealogist that he knew. Her name is Barbara Ray Venter, who was great. And we got two other people from Northern California at the Sacramento District Attorney's Office, an analyst there named Monica Sajowski, and then an investigator there named Kirk Campbell to work with us. And then at the FBI in Orange County, it was myself and one of our analysts on the Violent Crime Squad, Melissa Paraso. So that was a team of 6 people. And we sat down to build these family trees. Barbara Ray Venter, the genealogist, kind of explained to us how it worked. And the idea is like you take a match, say you have, a third cousin, or we'll say a second cousin match. Second cousins share great grandparents. First cousins share grandparents. Second cousins share great grandparents. Third cousins share great great grandparents. So, and I had no clue. Like I didn't know what a second cousin was versus a third cousin. And then you get into things like second cousins twice removed, what any of that stuff meant. I don't think any of us knew. Barbara explained it to us, and we were set to work. You want to identify, again, say on a second cousin match, who that second cousin's great grandparents are. Why? Because your bad guy, your killer, is likely to have one of the same great grandparents with a second cousin. So we started building up all the matches, finding out who their parents are, who their grandparents are, who their great grandparents are, trying to what we call merge matches. You want to find all the matches that, again, matches being individuals that have some shared DNA with your killer, in this case, the Golden State Killer. You want to identify what relatives have a common relative in their history. And this is what Steve was saying earlier. You want to build it up, and then you're essentially reverse engineering your family tree to see how you're related to your subject, in this case, the Golden State Killer. So we sat down and started doing that, building trees like crazy. And I don't think any of us did anything else. I mean, we were constantly trying to, and again, none of us, other than Barbara Venter, had ever done any type of genealogy at all. And we're doing it all on Ancestry.com, building up the family trees. And it took about 63 days, actually, for us to come up with Joe DeAngelo as our subject. But what we did first, we came up with an initial list of about 22 people. And here's how we did that. So we said, what do we know? Like, what do we know for sure about the Golden State Killer? Well, we know he's a man, and we know he's a white guy. And this is from surviving victim descriptions. We know he has to be born sometime between 1940 and maybe 1960. So that was kind of the age range, given what all the victims had said, how old they thought he was back in the 70s and 80s when they saw him. So, okay, we knew that. And we knew that he had light colored eyes and light blonde or brown hair. So those are all the things that we knew. And we knew he was described as being between 5'9" and 5'11". So we had a height range. So if you were 6'4", you probably weren't going to be the Golden State Killer. If you were, 5'6", you probably weren't the Golden State Killer. So with those physical descriptions and age brackets, we could go through the genealogy and eliminate people if they were too old or too young, or if they had died prior to one of the crimes occurring. Then we knew, obviously, you died in 1985. You couldn't have been the Golden State Killer because he committed his last crime that we knew of in 1986. So we developed a list of 22 people that we thought were they were good candidates. I call them our initial suspect list. And, these were people that kind of met all those criteria that we just went through. And genetically, they're on the family tree in a position where they could be related to the Golden State Killer and should be the Golden State Killer. They're all in a particular genetic range and a particular genealogy category.
Steve, let me stop you there for a second. And Jerry, I want to put this in perspective. I want to go back to the squad bay real quick. So remember, I told you in the beginning, the dynamic was everyone kind of thought Kramer was nuts. They thought this wasn't going to work. This wasn't going to happen. Well, as Steve and the team, Melissa and the other folks, are building these trees, they're printing these trees out and they're pasting them, they're taping them on the walls of the cubicles, in the squad base, so that other folks, because how this is, if maybe you're a white collar agent wandering over into the VCMO squad and you want to see what's going on, one by one, people would start to look at these trees and they would see the visual depiction of what Steve is describing to you right now. And you could see the wheels start to turn in their head where they would realize, oh, I see. I understand now. Now I get it.
Oh, yeah.
You have these distant relatives. They're connected. And then you have these, you can imagine like these trails of relatedness coming down through genealogy to all these different people that are on the suspect list. And you can see the light bulb start to go off in folks in their heads because they realized, wow, this is actually going to happen. They're going to figure this out here pretty soon. And it was a cool dynamic to watch that shift from Steve Kramer's Steve Kramer still is crazy. Let's call it what it is. But from Steve Kramer's crazy to Steve's crazy, and he's actually going to solve this case.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I'm sitting here having read up on this. And of course, I actually just this weekend, not even connecting it to having this interview with you today, was watching one of those Who Do You Think You Are shows. I was watching two shows, and it was Reba McEntire and Lionel Richie. It was just fascinating to watch that and to see how that type of ancestry testing is now leading to solving crimes. And as you're talking and I'm hearing more and more about this, yeah, I can see it. I can visualize it. And, it's exciting.
Yeah, it was great. The funny part, and Steve he's not incorrect. I mean, I don't think a lot of people really believe this. I think that's one of the reasons I kind of had free reign to do this genetic genealogy investigation, because I don't think anybody, including the FBI lab, any of the attorneys there, nobody really thought it would turn into anything. Now, I was fortunate. My boss at the FBI, Paul Raimondi, was great. He's like, keep doing what you're doing. It's awesome. Maybe you'll solve it. So I knew, like, once I understood the theory of how genetic genealogy worked, and once I knew that we were able to get the Golden State Killer's DNA, I 100% knew, like 100% knew we would solve this case. I didn't know whether or not, the Golden State Killer was dead or alive, but I told people, like in the office, maybe 6 months before we solved the case, I told them, I said, 100% I'm going to solve this case. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. And I told people I'm 80% confident I'll solve it in the next 12 months. I'm 100% confident it'll be solved in the next 5 years.
And were you correct about that?
I was actually wrong. We solved it. I think 6 months after that is when we actually solved it. Like, I realized at that point in time, like, once you understand genetic genealogy and how it works, you're going to solve the case. It's just a matter of putting, the effort and time into doing the genealogy on it. And so, I was very confident in it because I understood the science at that point in time. Yeah, it was great. So we ended up with 22 suspects. That looked really good from what, we had so far. And, we started looking at each individual, where they lived, where they're from, did they have any connections to Orange County, Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, any connection to the Sacramento area, things like that. And so we started going just very methodically through the list, not making anybody stand out any more than anybody else, just typical investigative work, right? Where you're going through and you're looking at your different subjects and trying to figure out, is this the guy that committed the crime? Running criminal history checks on all of them, things like that. And then something kind of dawned on us, like, what if, like, we got, this is, if you can imagine, right? We've taken thousands of people and whittled them down to 22. And I honestly, like, I didn't know. I'd never done a genetic genealogy case. No one had really done one like this, where you're actually going to try to arrest somebody. I'm like, maybe we should verify that these family trees that we've built in this list, we should probably try to verify that it's right. Like, I mean, it just seems like the logical thing to do. So maybe we should try to go get DNA from a relative on one of these trees and upload their DNA to the same database, to GEDmatch and to Family Tree DNA, to see if, like, if we think this person's like a second cousin to the Golden State Killer, we should go get that person's DNA, upload it, and see if it matches, as a second cousin, so to speak, just to kind of verify all this work we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 weeks. So we're looking at our list of subjects, and I looked at one of them. We'd run all the background information. We knew where they lived and things like that. And I realized one of them, from our family tree, had a relative, a woman, who lived just 2 miles from the FBI office in Orange County. In fact, she was really close to my house. Like, I would literally drive past her house when I'd go to and from work. And so we were sitting there, myself and these 2 agents, Chris Gickey and Steve Rathel again. And I'm like, what if we just get her DNA? So they grabbed an FBI DNA kit and they said, we'll go get her DNA right now. And so they were super excited. As Steve said, people were getting very excited now, like, this genetic genealogy magic, it actually might solve this case. So they ran off, found this woman, and knocked on her door, and super cooperative. They said, we're working on a serial killer case. They didn't say the Golden State Killer or anything like that. They just said a serial killer case. We think you're a relative, and a bunch of people have been murdered. Like, would you like to help us solve it? And she was super cooperative with them, said, absolutely. What do I need to do? Do you need to take my blood or whatever? And they're like, no. We just need to do a cheek swab. So they took a cheek swab of her, and they took the FBI DNA kit, put it in an envelope, and they threw it in a FedEx bin off to Family Tree DNA. And that, I remember they took a photo of it, of the DNA kit, after they got it. And it was about 45 minutes after they had left the office. And so we were super excited. And again, we had to wait a couple more weeks to get the results of that. But when we got that woman's DNA back, and she was, a close relative, we were able to eliminate, of the 22 people, genetically, we eliminated all but 6 people. So now we're down to 6 people on the list. So that made kind of that background work and, trying to do surveillance on different people a lot easier. So now we're down to 6. And of those 6, some of them were on the East Coast, never had set foot, as far as we could tell, at least living in California. One of them was 6'2", 6'1". So like that was kind of the upper end of our limit on height. So that was a lower probability. And then we looked at this one individual who happened to live in Citrus Heights, which is right at the heart of where this all started, back in the 1970s. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. And I remember it really well. We done his background, and he didn't stick out originally, particularly to Paul Holes, because he was a former police officer. And Paul was convinced, and probably rightly so, that there's no way like a police officer could do this, because he spent so much time as the East Area rapist committing these crimes. Paul just figured it would be very difficult for a police officer to get away with that. Obviously, in hindsight, that's completely wrong. I mean, he may have used that to his advantage. But Joe DeAngelo, as we looked at him, I mean, he had interned at a police department. He'd worked at 2 different police departments. And, he'd been in the military. And these are all things that they thought the Golden State Killer might have a background in, military and law enforcement. So he was checking a lot of boxes. And then Monica Sajowski was running through old newspaper articles online. And she started pulling up some really interesting things about Joe DeAngelo. One, that he had gotten caught shoplifting and fired from the police department. And he got caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. That just seems really weird for a cop to be stealing, and then stealing a hammer and dog repellent. And it was interesting to us because, I mean, he used tools like screwdrivers and hammers to break into homes. And a lot of people had bought dogs or had dogs. Other people had bought dogs during the East Area rapist crime spree because they were terrified of this guy. So they bought dogs for protection. And none of the dogs ever reacted. I mean, there was cases where the dogs didn't even bark at the Golden State Killer. So I don't know if he used, dog repellent or not. I don't think any of us will ever know that, but it was very interesting. And the one thing I noticed about that article that Monica found was he had been arrested on July 20th. No, I think I said 1978 earlier. Maybe it was 1979, July 20th, 1979. And there was never an East Area rapist attack ever again after that date. And everything moved down to the original Night Stalker down in Southern California. I just thought that was way too much of a coincidence that this guy gets arrested for shoplifting and then, fired a few months later from the police department. And there's never an East Area rapist attack after that. And at that point, that summer, the East Area rapists had been attacking like every 2 weeks. And the last attack was in early July. And this was about 2.5 weeks later. I think he was getting ready to go out on the attack that week, and he was getting his tools ready to go. And he got caught and fired. And that's when he decided to move to Southern California. The gig was up there. So that was kind of our hunch that it might be the guy.
And I just want to clarify for everyone that that's where he stopped in the East Area, but then he moved and continued his rapes and murders in Southern California.
That is correct. Okay. And that's when he became known as the original Night Stalker. Exactly. So that was very interesting. So we started doing a little more research on him, and we found out that he'd also been a police officer for the Exeter Police Department, which is a town, I'm told, about 15 minutes away from Visalia, California. Remember the Visalia ransacker? And the odds that this guy, this Joe DeAngelo, police officer in the Sacramento area and also a police officer in Exeter right next to Visalia, became really, really interesting. Now he was looking like, a major suspect because of this. Today, after doing a lot of genetic genealogy cases, I would say, yeah, slam dunk, that's him. But back then, we were, like I said, being very, very, very methodical about it. So we started looking at him a little bit more. And one of the things that was interesting, that he was a police officer there. And we're like, well, where did he go to the police academy? So we pulled his California records, and we were actually able to track them down. And when he was an Exeter police officer, he had actually gone on their police academy was at College of the Sequoias in central Visalia, right in the center of the city in Visalia. And so what we believe happened, he actually was a cadet at the police academy and going out and committing these crimes while he was at the police academy. And at that point in time, I think we were pretty convinced we had the right guy.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's just incredible.
This is the ransacking crimes.
That was the Visalia ransacker. And like I said, I think he finished in December. Like the last ransacking crime that we knew about was in December of 1975 when he shot at a police officer who was chasing him after a stakeout. Joe DeAngelo left the Exeter Police Department and moved to the Sacramento area. And I believe it got a job as a police officer there in June or July of 1976. And the East Area Rapist series began in June of 1976. So when we looked at that, we felt very confident that we had the right guy. And so it was at that point in time that all of us, and I mean all of us, the team, Melissa and myself and Paul Holes, we got on the phone, we called Marcus Knutson, the FBI case agent in Sacramento, and said, hey, I think we have the Golden State Killer. I'm going to send you his DMV photo and his name, Joseph James DeAngelo, born in 1945. He lives in Citrus Heights, and we think he's the guy. And he said, great. And then the FBI and the Sacramento Sheriff's Department put a surveillance on DeAngelo and started following him. And they eventually, when he was at, I believe, a Hobby Lobby, he parked his car there. They swabbed his door handle on the car, and they took the DNA from that back to the crime lab. And I remember it really well. It was on Friday. That was on Thursday, and it went to the crime lab, late Thursday, and the crime lab worked overnight on it. And Friday evening, I was at my daughter's swim practice, and I got a phone call as I was sitting next to the swimming pool there, and it was a Sacramento number, and it was from Kurt Campbell, who was working on it up there, and it was part of the crime lab. And I just remember very well, his first words to me were, Steve, what I'm about to tell you, you can't tell anybody. And I just remember, I knew obviously right then and there that it was a match. He goes, we got him. It's the Golden State Killer. And so I hung up. I called Paul Holes, and Kirk had just called him too. So Paul and I were yelling and screaming that we actually got the guy.
Hey, wait a minute! You weren't supposed to tell anybody.
Well, Paul Holes. I called Paul. I was like, "Did Kirk call you?" And he's like, "I can't believe it!" We were both screaming. And I remember because after the practice, it was a Friday night. We're out at a pizza place with some of my friends and my daughters and her friends, and I was just looking at my friends. I'm like, "Oh my god, I can't tell you guys, but I have the biggest news. I want to tell everybody." I'm like, I can't tell you anything. All I know is something really good has just happened. And so it was great. So we actually went out the following Monday or Tuesday. They got more DNA from him, from his trash, and they did it again. And it was, again, a perfect match. And the number was 47.5 septillion to 1 that there'd be a random match, but with that same STR profile. So it was 100% him. And it was great. So we were all super excited about it. So Melissa Paraso and myself, we ended up flying up along with a couple of agents, 3 agents, David Shea, Steve Rathall, and Chris Skicky, and all of us from Orange County, kind of the people that kind of worked on the case from the Violent Crime Squad, all flew up to Sacramento and waited for the Sacramento Sheriff's Department to arrest DeAngelo.
Hey, one thing, Jerry, I want to point out that's really, really important to understand in these cases, and Steve just went through it, but I want to make sure it's clear to the listeners, is genetic genealogy is an investigative lead. Okay, so in the context of the Golden State Killer case, after Steve and his team had done all of that work and they'd identified DeAngelo as a potential suspect, they did not run out and arrest DeAngelo based on the genealogy investigation. In fact, quite the opposite. They needed to obtain a confirmatory sample of his DNA, because the probable cause in the end of all of these cases, and this is kind of fast forwarding more into the usage of it now, is you have to have a 1-to-1 comparison of the crime scene DNA to the suspect that you believe committed the crime. That becomes your probable cause. That's the 1 in 47.5 septillion number that Steve mentioned before that came ultimately from a trash collection. And it's important for the listeners to understand that, because a lot of people, one of the major misconceptions about the use of genetic genealogy is that somehow these investigations are going to lead to the wrong arrest of somebody. We're going to build these crazy family trees and then just go out and put handcuffs on the wrong person. But that's not how it works in practice. In practice, we always obtain that confirmatory sample and do a 1-to-1 comparison of the suspect's DNA to the crime scene DNA to make sure it matches before handcuffs get put on anybody.
Right. You go back to the tried and true method of DNA matching.
That's right.
Wow. This has been fascinating. And we've learned so much now about this genetic genealogy. Now that this was successful, we know that it led to more usage. And so I'd love to take it to the next step. Once it was successful, how do you now create it as a tool that could be used by FBI agents and FBI attorneys and FBI folks and law enforcement all over the country, all over the world? And that's the end of part 1 of this 2-part interview. How's that for a cliffhanger? You'll be able to listen to part 2 next week. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Steve Kramer and Steve Busch, links to articles about the Golden State Killer case and investigative genetic genealogy, including the interim DOJ guidelines. There is also a link for FBI Retired Case File Review episode 242, where former BAU profiler Julia Cowley reviews the Golden State Killer investigation. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.